Okay, let's unpack this deep dive. We've got a truly fascinating source to explore today. Excerpts from Paul Krugman's book, Arguing with Zombies.
Hmm.
Think of this as a guided tour, led by someone who was right there, in the thick of the public debate,
Right.
showing us some of the major economic and political battles that have played out over the last couple of decades.
That's right.
Hmm.
Our mission here is really to cut through the noise and extract the most important insights the book offers.
Yeah.
Those surprising facts, the connections that aren't immediately obvious, and the core arguments being made.
So it's about getting you, the listener, quickly well-informed on these pretty complex topics without feeling like buried under jargon.
Exactly, without feeling overwhelmed.
And the key thread weaving through this source, it seems, is how economics gets completely tangled up with politics.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll see why some ideas, despite overwhelming evidence against them, just won't die the zombie ideas of the title.
The core concept.
And we'll look at what that means when we examine critical areas like healthcare, national debt, inequality, trade.
And even the pressures on democracy itself. It's a look at the reality of public debate, where evidence often just bumps up against powerful interests and ingrained beliefs.
Okay, let's jump right in then. One of the most interesting starting points from the source is the author's own path, how he became this, prominent public voice.
Yeah, apparently he never planned on being a pundit at all.
Really?
No, that's a key point the book makes. When he started his career, way back in the late 70s, he saw himself strictly as an academic economist.
A researcher, a teacher.
Exactly. Maybe offering technical advice to policymakers, a technocrat, not a public commentator arguing in the media.
So what was the catalyst? What pushed him out of that academic role and into the public arena?
Well, the source is pretty direct about this. It points squarely at the George W. Bush administration, specifically the lead up to the Iraq War. The author describes what he perceived as a level of dishonesty from the administration that he just hadn't witnessed before.
And he felt he had to speak out.
He felt compelled to speak out.
Yeah.
Especially when he felt others weren't, using his platform to challenge what he saw happening.
And that early period of his public writing where he's really taking on these issues, that's collected in a book called The Great Unraveling.
That's right.
So it sounds like that moment was a huge turning point for him.
It absolutely was. It marked his transition from, primarily academic work to actively engaging in public discourse, applying economic analysis to critically examine political events and policy decisions.
Which brings us right back to that central concept you mentioned, zombie ideas, the title of the book itself. What exactly does the source mean by a zombie idea?
He defines them as ideas that, evidence should have killed Stone dead.
Right.
But for some reason, they just keep shuffling along, influencing policy debates and public opinion, still kicking.
And the source connects this directly to the structure of modern American politics. It suggests that while political divides could be complex, in practice, they've increasingly aligned along a single, simple left-right axis. Is that right?
Yes, and the argument presented is that this kind of one-dimensional alignment, combined with pressure from certain political forces, particularly from the right, as the source details it, that's what helps keep these zombie ideas alive.
Okay, but why does the source pinpoint the right in this context? What's the reasoning there?
The book argues that while, sure, there are philosophical arguments for limited government and low taxes.
Right, the intellectual case.
A powerful driving force in modern conservatism, according to the source, comes from wealthy individuals and groups.
Ah, okay.
These are people who stand to benefit significantly financially from policies that favor deregulation, lower taxes on capital, and, weaken social safety nets.
So the argument is that the money keeps the ideas going.
The source contends that the financial and political support from these interests acts kind of like a life support system, propping up these ideas even when evidence suggests they are ineffective or maybe even harmful to the broader population.
Interesting. So the money provides the brains for the zombie, in a way.
You could put it that way, yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at where these zombie ideas have done battle. Healthcare is a huge one, right? And the source spends a lot of time on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare.
Definitely. That's presented as a prime example. The road to getting the ACA passed and just the intense political opposition it faced, described using terms like a cruelty caucus in the source to highlight the seemingly absolute opposition. That's a key narrative here.
And one absolutely crucial insight the source offers about the ACA's design is this idea of the three-legged stool. Why is that analogy so important?
It's key because if Even one leg is weak or removed, the whole thing wobbles or, potentially collapses.
Okay, so what are the three legs?
As the source explains them. First, the requirement that insurers cover people regardless of pre-existing medical conditions.
Oh, that's leg one.
Second, the individual mandate requiring most people to have health insurance.
Yeah.
Leg two.
Right, the controversial one.
And third, subsidies to make that insurance affordable for lower and middle income folks. Leg three.
And how do they support each other? Why are all three needed?
Well, they're completely interdependent. Think about it. If you guarantee coverage for pre-existing conditions, leg one,
Yeah.
but you don't have the mandate, leg two,
Uh-huh.
healthy people might just wait until they get sick to buy insurance.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
So the insurance pool gets sicker and more expensive, premiums skyrocket, and healthy people are driven out. That's the dreaded death spiral opponents we're always talking about.
So the mandate was meant to keep the pool balanced.
Exactly. Keep a mix of healthy and sick people in the pool. And the subsidies just made it financially possible for those who needed help buying in.
And the source details how opponents specifically targeted this structure, right? Like removing the mandate penalty.
And undermining efforts to get people enrolled.
Yeah.
Sabotage, essentially.
Exactly. These were explicit attempts, as described in the source, to cause the program to fail, to sort of demonstrate that the stool couldn't stand on its own.
Right, to prove their point that it wouldn't work.
Yet, despite these efforts and all the predictions of collapse, the source argues that the ACA has largely been working pretty well.
That's the author's assessment presented in the book, yeah. The source points to the dramatic reduction in the number of uninsured Americans,
Right.
largely through Medicaid expansion in states that adopted it, and through the insurance exchanges as evidence that the core goal was achieved. Maybe imperfectly and definitely despite the political headwinds, but achieved.
The comparison to other wealthy countries in the source is pretty stark, isn't it?
It really highlights the uniqueness, maybe not in a good way, of the U.S. system.
Yeah.
Virtually every other wealthy nation provides universal health care coverage.
And they do it cheaper.
And crucially, according to the sources, they generally achieve better health outcomes at lower per-person costs than the U.S. does. Even countries like the U.K. that spend significantly less per person.
Wow.
It really challenges the idea that the U.S. private system is somehow inherently more efficient or better.
And speaking of efficiency, there's that surprising example, the source uses of a successful government-run system within the U.S., the Veterans Health Administration, the VHA.
Yeah, the VHA is presented as a really interesting counter-narrative. The source notes that after some significant reforms back in the 1990s, the VHA transformed and is now often recognized, even by some private sector metrics, as providing high-quality, efficient care.
So it serves as an example within the source to push back against that blanket assertion that government healthcare is always inefficient.
Exactly. Contrasting it with perceived inefficiencies in parts of the complex U.S. private system.
The source also lays bare the political tactics used in these healthcare battles. You mentioned the cruelty caucus, but also things like smear and fear campaigns, labeling guaranteed insurance as European-style socialized medicine.
Yes, and the political calculation described in the source that opponents often don't even need to offer a viable alternative plan.
Just scare people off.
Their goal is simply to scare voters away from the proposed change. The source reminds us this tactic isn't new either.
Like with Medicare.
Exactly. Recalling how Ronald Reagan used similar arguments against Medicare when it was debated, claiming it would lead to the end of American freedom.
And yet, once enacted, Medicare became incredibly popular.
Massively popular, which is sort of the point.
It's also noted in the source that sometimes the media or elite pundits were slower to grasp the positive impact of the ACA. Why was that?
Well, the authors suggest this might be because individuals in higher socioeconomic brackets who tend to have good employer-sponsored insurance anyway.
Right, they weren't the ones directly affected.
They were less directly exposed to the problems the ACA was designed to fix, like being denied for pre-existing conditions or just not having affordable options. Their personal experience didn't really reflect the reality for millions gaining coverage, which could potentially color their perspective.
Okay, that healthcare fight really highlights the political tactics and the battle of ideas. Let's shift gears a bit to another area the source digs into: the housing bubble and the debt debates that followed the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. The source illustrates the speculative nature of the housing bubble using this really clear geographical contrast.
Between flatland and the zone?
Exactly. It compares price increases in flatland areas like Houston or Atlanta, where building is relatively unrestricted, with zone areas like New York, Miami, or San Diego, where development is limited by geography or zoning laws.
And the difference in price appreciation was huge in those zones, wasn't it? That San Diego example feels particularly stark.
It really drives the point home. The source cites data from the mid-2000s showing that in San Diego, renting a house costs only about 40% of owning a similar one, even with low interest rates.
Wow, only 40%.
Yeah. The author's argument is that nobody rational would buy those prices unless they were speculating,
Just betting on the price going up.
betting heavily on future price increases to make money from capital gains. That, the source says, is a classic sign of a bubble.
And what factors contributed to inflating that bubble, according to the source?
Well, financial innovation and deregulation play significant roles. The source criticizes policymakers who kind of committed to this belief that markets are always self-correcting, ignored warning signs. Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chair, is specifically cited for dismissing warnings about excessive risk-taking.
And even Treasury Secretary Paulson later admitted.
Yeah, Henry Paulson admitted, as noted in the source, that financial innovation had basically outrun regulation. Plus, the compensation systems on Wall Street, which heavily rewarded taking on risk, are also highlighted as a contributing factor.
Then the bubble burst, leading to the crisis. The source talks about the problem of deleveraging afterwards. Can you help us understand that term?
Sure. Think of it like this. Deleveraging is when everyone, families, businesses, even governments, simultaneously tries to pay down debt.
Sounds sensible individually.
On an individual level, it sounds responsible, right? But the source explains that when everyone does it at once across the whole economy, it becomes a huge drag.
How so?
Because your spending is my income and my spending is your income. If everyone is cutting back on spending to pay down debt, overall demand falls, incomes fall globally. And ironically, that makes it harder for everyone to pay down their debt because their incomes have shrunk.
Yeah.
It's a collective action problem.
And the source takes on that common misunderstanding about national debt, the one often presented as being just like a family maxing out credit cards, that stop stealing from our kids idea.
Oh yeah, the author is quite forceful in debunking that analogy. A family owes money to other people, right?
Yeah.
To the bank, the credit card company. The world economy, collectively, essentially owes money to itself. And specifically for the U.S., the source points out that America has actually borrowed less from abroad since the 2008 crisis than it did before.
Less. That's counterintuitive.
It is. The real issue isn't the U.S. as a whole getting poorer due to internal debt. It's more about the distribution who owes whom within the country and that overall economic drag caused by widespread deleveraging we just talked about.
But despite this nuance, the source details a significant push for austerity policies after 2010, a big focus on cutting deficits.
Yes, there was intense political focus on reducing government budget deficits, even when unemployment was sky high and the economy desperately needed stimulus, needed demand.
And the source argues this push was often based on flawed arguments.
Flawed, sometimes bad faith arguments is the perspective presented. These anti-stimulus austerity measures are seen in the source as having caused unnecessary job losses and prolonged economic suffering, dragging out the recovery.
And there was that particularly influential academic paper used to justify this austerity push, right? The Reinhardt-Rogoff paper.
Right, the Reinhardt-Rogoff paper. It claimed that government debt levels above 90% of GDP severely hindered economic growth, became a huge talking point.
And the source describes how this paper was initially seized upon politically.
Oh, absolutely.
But later faced intense scrutiny from other researchers. What did that scrutiny reveal? This is one of those surprising details.
Oh, it's quite a story. It's presented in the source. Basically, other economists couldn't replicate the results.
Okay.
When they finally got access to the original data spreadsheet, this is the amazing part, they found several issues.
Like what?
Well, it omitted data from several countries and years, it used what critics considered questionable statistical methods, and, maybe most famously,
The Excel error.
it contained a basic Excel coding error that incorrectly averaged data and significantly affected the paper's key finding about that 90% threshold.
Wow. A spreadsheet error influencing global policy.
It really undermined a cornerstone argument for austerity at a critical time. Plus, the source notes, critics pointed out that correlation isn't causation,
Meaning?
meaning maybe poor economic performance causes high debt, rather than high debt causing poor performance.
Yeah.
The direction of causality wasn't clear.
That detail about the Excel error is just quite a picture. A major policy justification built partly on a spreadsheet mistake.
It really is.
This focus on debt leads the source to talk about debt scolds or deficit scolds. What's meant by that?
The author uses these terms quite critically, yeah, highlighting what the source perceives as hypocrisy and double standards.
How so?
The argument presented is that these figures often express great alarm about deficits, primarily when Democrats are in power and proposing spending, but are notably less concerned or even supportive when Republicans enact large tax cuts that also significantly increase the deficit. A selective alarm, basically.
Got it. The source also briefly mentions a more technical point about interest rates versus growth rates. R versus G. Why does that matter for the debt discussion?
This might sound technical, but the source points out it's actually a crucial detail often missed in the public debate.
Yeah.
R is the interest rate the government pays on its debt.
Okay.
And G is the rate at which the overall economy is growing.
Right.
The source notes that if R is lower than G, if the interest rate is lower than the growth rate, which has often been the case recently,
Then what?
then the debt burden automatically shrinks relative to the size of the economy over time, even without painful budget cuts or tax hikes. The economy is basically outgrowing the debt.
Ah, so the problem kind of solves itself, to a degree.
To some extent, yes. This context, according to the source, significantly reduces the urgency of immediate, drastic deficit reduction, especially when rates are low and growth is possible. It changes the calculation.
Okay, that's helpful. Let's shift gears again to inequality and worker power, another major area the source examines. The core argument here seems to be that America has become increasingly skewed.
Yeah, the source uses that term skewed to describe the dramatic shift in income distribution over recent decades, with a disproportionately large share flowing to a very, very small elite.
And the data points cited from sources like the CBO are pretty striking, aren't they?
They really paint the picture. The source highlights figures showing, for example, that between 1977 and 1989, just one period, the top 1% of families saw their after-tax incomes roughly double.
Double. And what about others?
While the bottom 20% actually saw their incomes decrease, and other income groups saw only pretty modest gains.
So the gains weren't shared broadly at all.
Not according to this data, no. Heavily concentrated at the very top.
The source also challenges some common ideas about why inequality has risen, doesn't it?
Yes, it tackles a couple of common misconceptions. One is the idea that it's simply about highly educated people doing well while less educated people struggle.
It's more complicated than that.
The source argues it's more specific. It's a small subset of the elite, even among the highly educated, pulling away dramatically from everyone else, including other college graduates, not just college versus non-college.
Okay. And the other challenged idea?
The idea that the decline in fortunes for, say, blue-collar workers is due to a breakdown in family values or morals, sort of blaming the victim.
And the source counters that. How?
It counters this, citing the sociologist William Julius Wilson, who argued pretty powerfully that it's the lack of jobs and economic opportunity that causes social disruption and strains families,
The cause and effect are reversed.
rather than the other way around. Economic conditions creating social problems, not social problems causing economic decline. That's the perspective presented.
Got it. And a key factor contributing to wage stagnation for most workers, according to the source, is declining worker bargaining power.
Yes, that's presented as a central piece of the puzzle.
How does the source illustrate that decline? What are the indicators?
It points to a couple of key things. First, the falling real value of the federal minimum wage over the past half-century. It just hasn't kept pace with inflation or rising productivity.
Right. Buys less than it used to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And second, the significant decline of unions, especially in the private sector.
And why does that matter for wages?
Well, the source argues that weakened unions mean workers simply have less power to negotiate for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. So more of the economic gains end up accruing to capital and management, not labor.
Regional inequality also gets a brief mention, right? Gaps between places.
Yes, just noting that some geographic areas are lagging significantly behind others, often struggling with the decline of old industries and experiencing a brain drain.
Skilled workers leaving.
Yes, skilled workers moving elsewhere for opportunity, which just exacerbates the divide between thriving areas and struggling ones.
And this increasing inequality, as the source describes it, links to a potentially more disturbing concept, the rise of an oligarchy.
Right. The source suggests that extreme inequality isn't just an economic outcome. It's intimately linked to power dynamics and potentially corruption.
How so?
Societies with massive levels of inequality, the source argues, looking at both historical and modern examples, tend to see wealth translate directly into political power.
Money buys influence.
Exactly. Potentially leading to a system where policies primarily serve the interests of the wealthy elite rather than the broader public good. It adds this really important political and social dimension to the economic data.
Okay, let's pivot from domestic economic issues to trade. Another area where the source highlights a battle between evidence and political narratives.
Right. The consensus view among economists, as summarized in the source, is that international trade is generally beneficial overall for the economy as a whole. But the source emphasizes the conflicts it creates are primarily within countries, not between them.
Explain that.
Exporting industries benefit, consumers benefit from lower prices, sure. But industries that compete with imports can definitely be hurt, leading to job losses in specific sectors or regions. So the political tension is internal. It's domestic.
Who wins and who loses inside the country?
Exactly. Not fundamentally between, say, the U.S. and China as monolithic blocks, according to this view.
And the source traces an interesting historical shift in U.S. trade policy away from pure protectionism.
Yeah, before the 1930s, U.S. policy was often highly protectionist, driven by domestic special interests just lobbying Congress for tariffs on their specific goods.
So how did that change?
The source credits FDR's Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934 with initiating a fundamental change. It moved towards a rules-based reciprocal system.
And what did that do politically?
Critically, it brought export industries into the political equation. They now had a stake in lower tariffs abroad, creating a counterweight to the protectionist demands of import-competing industries.
Balancing the interests.
Right. And this approach, this reciprocal rules-based system, became the template for the global trading system, eventually leading to the WTO.
The source then offers a critique of more recent U.S. trade policy, specifically the use of tariffs and trade disputes under the Trump administration. How's that framed?
It's framed as a sharp departure from that established rules-based approach that the U.S. itself largely built.
A break from the past.
Yeah. The source characterizes it as Trumpism, marked by what the author sees as, quote, belligerent ignorance of economic realities.
Strong words.
And a return to a system where rules are kind of disregarded to serve specific, often domestic special interests, potentially undermining the whole global system the U.S. helped create over decades.
Okay, now let's try and tie a lot of these threads together by looking at the political landscape itself and what the source describes as threats to democracy. This seems to be a major theme.
It really is. The book offers a specific characterization of the modern Republican Party, describing it as dominated by movement conservatism.
What does that mean exactly?
It's portrayed as a more monolithic structure compared to the Democratic Party, which is seen as a looser coalition. This movement conservatism is described as heavily influenced by big money and partisan media, and fostering political loyalists, people loyal to the movement above all else, referred to in the source as apparatchiks.
And there's also a strategy the source describes as bait and switch. What's that about?
This tactic, according to the source's analysis, involves mobilizing voters, using social issues, cultural anxieties, maybe themes like national security. That's the bait.
Okay.
But then, after winning elections, the actual policies pursued primarily benefit corporations and the wealthy tax cuts, deregulation. That's the switch.
I see. The source also mentions wingnut welfare.
Yeah, that's used as a term for the network of think tanks, media outlets, foundations that provide positions and financial support for these political loyalists when they're out of government. Kind of a safety net for the faithful.
The source also points to what it calls empty quarters in the political spectrum. What are those?
Specifically, the perceived absence, or at least scarcity, of significant politicians who are economically liberal but socially conservative.
And why does that matter?
The source argues that this vacuum allowed the Republican Party to attract white working-class voters based on appeals related to social and racial anxieties, cultural issues,
Right.
even while promoting economic policies, like cuts to social programs or weakened worker protections, that were arguably not in those voters' direct financial interest.
And the tactic of labeling democratic policies as socialism comes up here too, right?
Yes. The source discusses how even policies described as sort of standard social democratic goals, things like guaranteed health care or higher taxes on the wealthy.
Things polls often show are popular.
Exactly. Policies which polls often show have significant public support are attacked using the socialism label. The author calls this scaremongering silly and dishonest, but acknowledges it can be politically effective in framing debates and scaring people off.
And the source makes a really strong claim that when their agenda faces political rejection by voters, parts of the Republican Party resort to undermining democratic processes themselves.
Yeah, this is a very serious charge made in the source. It points to actions described as attempts at election rigging, using the Georgia example, stripping power from newly elected officials of the opposing party, like in Wisconsin,
Right, changing the rules after losing.
and using courts filled with political loyalists. Apparatchik stuffed courts is the term used in the source to strike down legislation on what the source sees as weak legal grounds.
So a breakdown of norms.
There's a perceived erosion of respect for institutional norms, definitely. Like the Senate's traditional role of advising consent on appointments potentially becoming just rubber stamp consent.
The role of media bias and this idea of false equivalence in political coverage is also touched upon.
Right. The source suggests that in an effort to appear fair and balanced, mainstream media sometimes gives undue weight to arguments that, frankly, lack factual basis.
Creating a false balance.
Exactly. Creating a false equivalence between credible claims, supported by evidence, and unsubstantiated ones, just because they come from the other side. Examples are given like perceived excessive focus on criticisms of figures like Hillary Clinton or highlighting the wealth of Democratic candidates without similar scrutiny of Republicans.
Climate change denial is presented as another key example of this dynamic where evidence is rejected, isn't it?
Yes, it's framed in the source not just as some kind of good faith scientific disagreement, but as an instance of bad faith arguments.
Driven by?
Often serving specific financial interests, like those linked to fossil fuels, the Koch brothers, are mentioned as an example,
Okay.
and also becoming intertwined with a political identity. A way, as the source puts it rather bluntly, of owning the libs. It's tribal as much as anything.
And the source connects this directly to the idea of Trumpism. How?
The argument presented is that climate denial served as a kind of crucible for Trumpism, reflecting a deeper commitment within parts of the political landscape to denying established facts and actively attacking the sources of those facts, including scientists. The source notes how climate scientists have faced demands for their emails and other forms of harassment in an apparent attempt to discredit them and their work.
The source also includes some mentions of more technical economic concepts, just briefly reminding us of the author's academic background.
Yeah, just quick mentions of things like the ISLM model, its relationship to modern monetary theory, or MMT, and the author's own Nobel-winning academic work on increasing returns in economic geography. It just briefly highlights, as the source does, how these theoretical foundations inform his public commentary and analysis of real-world policy challenges. Shows where he's coming from intellectually.
So taking all this in, all these different threads, what's the overall picture painted by these excerpts from Arguing with Zombies?
Well, it's a picture of a persistent and often really intense struggle, a battle, really.
Between...
On one side, you have ideas and programs supported by a large body of evidence and analysis, what some call saltwater economics, or policies like Social Security and the ACA, that, according to the source, have largely worked, maybe imperfectly, but worked.
And on the other side?
On the other side are these politically motivated zombie ideas that just keep getting resurrected and promoted, often fueled by money serving specific interests, even when the facts suggest they are harmful or ineffective. Still walking around.
It really highlights how economic outcomes, like the rise of inequality, are presented not just as neutral results of market forces,
Right, not an evidence.
but as being significantly shaped by political power dynamics, ideological battles, and, well, strategic tactics.
Absolutely. And it raises deep concerns, as the source clearly articulates, about the health of democratic institutions themselves.
Oh, so.
When facts are disregarded, when established norms are challenged or broken, when processes seem to be manipulated to achieve partisan goals, potentially at the expense of widely supported policies or the public good. That's a threat to the whole system, according to this analysis.
So what does this deep dive into these sources mean for you listening to this? We've explored a perspective that sees the public arena as this constant battleground
A real fight.
between evidence-based ideas and these tenacious viewpoints that just refuse to die, often driven by powerful political and financial forces.
Yeah, forces keeping them alive.
We've seen how debates around healthcare, debt, inequality, even trade are frequently framed, according to the source, less by objective facts and more by power, ideology, and deliberate tactics designed to keep certain ideas in play, regardless of their real-world impact.
This has underscored the deep connections between economic realities and political forces, and highlighted what the source views as significant stakes for the functioning of democracy itself when evidence is disregarded and institutions are challenged.
So this leaves us with an important question, something for you to consider for yourself. In a world just awash in information and competing claims, where evidence itself is often contested, how do you go about distinguishing between a robust, evidence-based argument and one of these zombie ideas that keeps shambling forward despite the facts seemingly stacked against it?